This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome, everybody, to GlugNet. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Carl Franklin, and we are going to be celebrating the 20th anniversary of GlugNet as an organization with a very special talk on WPF and Blazor. A little bit about us. We are the Greater Lansing user group for .NET developers, based out of Okemos, Michigan, pictured here. Our meetings are free and open to the public, held every month on the third Thursday. For more information on upcoming meetings, the best place to find that in would be the meetup site, meetup.com/glugnet. This year, we are looking to incorporate some lightning talks. So if you are interested in giving a 10 to 15-minute presentation on a topic, if you could let Joe or I know, we will get you scheduled for that. At this time, we would like to thank our sponsors, NIS Technologies, who's given us this go-to session, the .NET Foundation, who helps pay the bills for the organization, and TechSmith, our usual physical hosting site. All meetups are recorded and posted to YouTube by Sam Nasser. You can find that site either using this QR code or going to youtube.com/@SamNasserMVP. During tonight's presentation, if you have a question or you're answering a question from our speaker, feel free to unmute and talk. If not, we just ask that you please stay muted so we can all hear the presentation. If you do not want to speak up, you can use the chat feature in GoTo as well, and those questions will get filtered to Carl. At the conclusion of tonight's presentation, there will be an anonymous feedback survey. All those responses get summarized and sent to our speaker so he can improve his future presentations. So if you would please consider filling that out, we would very much appreciate it. And last but not least, some additional meetups in the area that you might be interested in. The Cleveland C# VBNet user group, the Greater Lansing Air Force SQL server. There's a .NET study group.
Looks like Steven is having some bandwidth issues.
Well, Joe, go ahead and introduce Carl.
Oh, well, sure. Carl Franklin is a very, very long-time personality in the development world, long even before .NET. Carl was, I first heard of Carl in a software company he was a part of many years ago called Crescent Software. It was VB6 tools, I think, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think we started with VB1 or VB2, maybe.
VB1, VB2, yeah. So when I was a VB developer, I used Crescent Tools, and that's where I learned of Carl and his partner in crime, Ethan Weiner, if I remember the name right.
Yeah, he was the owner.
Yeah, owner. So that goes way, way back, much more than 20 years. And so Carl and I had a similar path up to the .NET world through VB6, and then I think you probably spent some time in VB.NET as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved to C#, so similar path. Yeah. Carl is probably best known for, well, he does so many things, it's hard to say what he's best known for. But I would say in the .NET world, at least, he's best known for a show called .NET Rocks. You have been the original host from the very beginning, correct?
That's right, yeah. 2002, so do the math.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the word podcast came on the scene in 2003 or 2004.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing. I can tell you that personally, it was my main learning tool when I first started out in .NET, so I very much appreciate your efforts personally, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people that feel the same way. Richard Campbell has been on there a long time, but he was not the first co-host. Was Rory the first, or?
No, Rory was the second. Mark Dunn was the first. Yeah.
Okay, I don't remember Markdown. I remember Rory. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's you get to talk to a lot of really cool people. I'm very jealous. And you have a lot of fun. It's not just facts and figures
Certainly.
the whole time, right?
Certainly. And yeah, that's the idea. We don't want people to fall asleep.
So, and through all those interviews and all the coding that you do, I think you spend, you said close to half your time still coding. So
Mm-hmm.
as a result of all of that, Carl is just a wealth of knowledge, and we're very, very pleased and happy and privileged to have you tonight as our guest to kick off our 20th year. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Carl.
Thank you. Happy to be here. So lately, since Blazor came on the scene, I started a web show called a YouTube show called Blazor Train, and you can get to that at blazortrain.com. And there's almost 100 episodes there, and they're sort of just categorized little snacks of how to do this, how to do that. And then when Maui was coming out, I started another one called the .NET Show, and that's at the.netshow.com. And so that started before Maui with Xamarin Forms, just talking about, hey, the future is Maui. We're just going to learn how Xamarin Forms does its thing, and then we'll figure out how Maui's different. And so that's a good place if you're looking for mobile stuff. But yes, and David just is putting in the links there. But this content that I'm going to show you was from originally from Blazor Train episode 71. And the whole idea was that Microsoft had just come out with their WebView control. And the WebView is a very light control that you can use in a Windows application or a .NET application, desktop, Maui. I think they do Maui as well. Yeah, I know they do. And it basically contains a web browser. And so we've had those web browsers that we can use in programs, Windows programs, for years. But then, there was a dark time for these things, right? And it was, I can't remember when it started, but at a certain point, it was very, very difficult to embed a web browser in a WPF or a Windows application because of security reasons. And so those things, Chromium being what it is, there's basically a Chromium-based WebView, very lightweight WebView. You have to have Edge, but guess what? Windows comes with Edge, so that's not an issue. Originally I did this against .NET 6 with a preview version of the WebView control. But what we're going to do is build a WPF app that uses Blazor instead of XAML. XAML is still there, and I'll even show you how you can interact between XAML and XAML code and Blazor code and call them interchangeably. So this isn't going to be a counter demo, right? Like most Blazor demos are. It's not going to be press the button and increment the counter. We will do some basic interactions, but I'm going to go so much deeper. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to build a WPF app. We're going to install that WebView WPF control from NuGet. We're going to call JavaScript from C# code, right? We're going to call C# code from JavaScript. We're going to create a child component, a Razor child component, and we'll access that. And then we're going to be able to call code, like I said, inside the Razor component or in C# in the Blazor part from WPF and vice versa. We're going to load a third-party Blazor component and use that. We're going to handle cascading parameters or cascading components, and those are a special breed, a special configuration that Blazor uses, but it's not entirely intuitive how to do that in a WPF application. And then we're just going to clean up using statements using an imports Razor file and some global using statements. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, And let me know when you can all see it. You can see it? Okay, we see it. Good. And I just created a Blazor application called WPF Blazor. That's it. And it just runs. There's nothing in it, right? So this is just basic stuff. I didn't start with any particular type of template. It's just a Blazor template. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the CS proj file to load this web view control and a couple other things too. So I had to add this root namespace, WPF Blazor. That's necessary. I removed the nullable requirements, so we're not going to get null squigglies all over the place. And this is the package right here, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components WebView WPF. By the way, this is what I used as a startup document, as a start document, build a Windows presentation foundation WPF Blazor app. This really doesn't go as deep as where I'm going, but this is where I got the basic idea. This right here is the ASP.NET Core Components web view right there. And you can look at the repository as well. And it's all right here. So it's completely open source and very easy to use. All right, so that's step one. Also, I added Razor to the project type. So the SDK of a regular WPF app is Microsoft.NET.SDK. So you do .Razor, and now this becomes a Blazor or a Razor component. Okay. So we're going to create a web root folder. Huh? This is a WPF app. I know. But Blazor, even though it's not necessarily for the web, you can access resources for JavaScript files, HTML files, CSS files, but they have to be in web root. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to add index HTML because that's how Blazor gets set up, right? By the way, are you loving this? Add new item. Now it's just like Mads Christensen's, add file. Some things are just good ideas and they should be in the product. So here's index HTML. I'm just going to copy over. Now this is essentially the boilerplate HTML code in a WebAssembly application. So the difference here is that the framework is blazor.webview.js because it's a little bit different. But that's really the only difference here. Also, I don't have any. There isn't any stuff built in, right? There isn't any index and counter and fetch data. There's no nav menu. There's no main layout. There's none of the stuff in Blazor that you'd normally associate with. There's no in app. There's no app Razor where you can put cascading components. There's no router because it's not a web app, right? So you're looking at just the basic stuff that you need from the website to be able to instantiate Blazor components and make it work. Because after all, we are running in a web control. We're going to be running in this web control. So it ultimately does have to be web content. But we don't have all the navigation stuff that the browser has, etc. So I'm also going to add CSS file. So this will be app.css. And nothing crazy about this, just the standard stuff. I added this padding because if you don't add that, everything just bumps up against the edge of the of the window, and that's not very cool. Not very cool looking. All right, so now guess what? We're going to add a component called index razor. It's not going to have much in it. We're expecting this message string, and so we're going to do a code behind file for this. So I will add index.razor.cs. And there it is. So here's our message. Hey, it's Blazor and WPF. Now the next thing we need to do is set up this main window XAML so that it displays the Blazor view right here. And we're going to start with the CS file, code behind file. So I've really simplified this, and by using implicit usings in .NET 7, we get rid of a lot of those using statements. But check this out. This should look familiar to you if you've done any ASP.NET programming, right? You have a service collection, and now we're adding this resource called services by building the service collection, right? And we can add our services right here. Service collection dot add whatever. Add WPF Blazor Web View is what we need in order to access this component. And so then we can access that by the resource services. So now that we've done that, let's go back to the XAML file here, and we'll modify that. So here we go. We've got a local XML, XML namespace, WPF Blazor, and we've got a namespace called Blazor, which is really the WebView WPF. Notice that it's WebView.WPF. It's not just WebView. So this one is specifically made for WPF. Now in the grid, I just take up the whole space on the page with this Blazor WebView. So it has a host page property, which we point to our index HTML. It has the services, which is our dynamic resource services. And there's a root components collection, and we're just adding a single root component, and the selector is app. Now take a look at the index page. If you've done any Blazor, you know that there's an app component, and this is a placeholder for it. And then when it instantiates, that's what it will be. That will be the selector app. And the ID is app. And the component type is of index. So our index razor file is going to be the main page for this main window XAML. Now, one thing that I have learned about Blazor and XAML together from the Maui stuff is you can't combine within the same in a Maui app. In a Maui page, you can't combine XAML components and Blazor components. And that's true here too. This is a XAML component, right? But since we're loading it, and inside of it, we're loading all of those Blazor components that we will have, we can add other XAML components here. We could put, it's a grid. We could put this in just one part of the grid. In one row, we could add other rows with other XAML components in it if you want. It really is a hybrid solution. So we're going to build. I always like to build before I run. I know it builds when you run, but it's just a pet peeve of mine. I like to build. Sometimes Visual Studio kind of gets confused about, what objects are in scope, and rebuilding does the trick. I'm sure none of you have experienced that. Hey, it's Blazor and WPF. Now, this right here is cool enough. I could stop and I could say, that's my demo, guys. I'm done. I'm out of here. But obviously, we can do so much more. But just think about what this is. This is a window, a WPF window. That comes from our WPF, name, title, WPF Blazor. And this content comes from Blazor. This is a browser, basically. So let's do a basic interaction. I'm going to open Index Razor. And I'll just put a button below this message. And I've got this click me, which now I need to add to my code behind. So I'll do that right here. Now all I'm doing is I'm setting the message, which if you remember is bound right there. All I'm doing is saying message updated at and whatever time it is. Simple. So yeah, this is sort of like the counter demo. Okay, I just wanted to show a simple interaction. And also to show you that, and I look at this, I can do a mouse wheel to increase the size. I love that. Just to show you that, yeah, you can do this and it doesn't require any crazy binding or any notify property changed. Like the binding model of the Blazor component model is so elegant, and you can thank Steve Sanderson for that. Next time you see him, just tell him how awesome he is, because he hates it when you tell him how awesome he is. He's very modest. Okay, so now let's go forward with a child component. See how that works. So I'll create a folder called components. And to that, I'm going to add child component.razor. So this is going to be very simple. We'll clean up our using statements later. So this just shows a message in a div, no big whoop. But let's add child component razor CS, the code behind file. Okay. So we define the namespace right here, WPF Blazor components. And this is just a simple code behind. You're inheriting from component base. We have a message here, and on initialized, we're setting that message to child component initialized at and whatever time it is now. And now all we have to do if we want to run this and show it is stuff. So we have our namespace using WPF Blazor components, click me button still there, and the child component a couple of spaces down. So we've added some more using statements, but we'll clean those up in a minute. And here we go. There it is. No notify property changed. No, crazy binding stuff. It's just easy. Any questions before we move on? Okay. So the next part of the demo is to call into JavaScript. So I'm going to go into my HTML file, and I'll put a script tag right here. So this script basically has a method get window width, and this is just sort of global JavaScript parlance and syntax if you're going to call this from Blazor. There's better ways to do this, but that's what we're going to do. So get window width is going to return window.innerWidth. And whenever we call this, whatever the current width of the window is, that's going to get returned. All right, now let's go to Index Razor. and update that. Now I'm using Microsoft Interop and I'm injecting a JavaScript runtime. Okay. And so now we're going to update the click me handler instead of saying, A from whatever it says here, message updated at. We're going to call into JavaScript to get the width. That's going to return an int. And then we'll set message to message updated at whatever, but then window width is that particular width. So now we've got a C# app that is hosting a web view that is calling C# code with Blazor, which is calling JavaScript and returning it. So that's 722. Click again, 943. And we still are this is still being reported from the child component. You can, of course, do anything in the child component that you can do in the page. All right, so now I told you we're going to clean up the using statements. Let's do that. So I can add a new Razor component here called _imports Razor. And this is a known file name. And if you do any Blazor programming, you would know that this file contains @using statements. And so these will become globally available for components and pages in Blazor for any component, but not in C# files. We're going to need global usings for those. So again, this is only for accessing stuff in our Razor files or code behind. So if now I can get rid of these using statements right here in index Razor, and then child component, I can get rid of that and just run it again, make sure everything still works. And it does. So there. So now we're going to call C# from JavaScript. And I'm going to update my JavaScript code here in index, not index Razor, but in index HTML. And I'll add a couple of things. So I've got this global .NET helper, which gets set here in registered WPF app. And then I add an event listener for whenever the window resizes. And that is handle resize. So this gets called anytime the user resizes the window or anytime it resizes of its own accord. And here I'm invoking a method on the reference, the component that this reference points to, called window resized, and I'm passing the width and height of the window. So now we need a window resized method in our C# code that this can call. So to do that, let me just update code behind for index. We've got a few things here. So we still have our message. We still have click me. But on after render async in the Blazor component model is a virtual method that gets called after every render. So Blazor is totally not like XAML, totally not like WPF or Xamarin Forms or Maui or any other XAML thing. Basically, every component renders when anything in it changes, and there's a system watching out for that already. So that's why it doesn't require on property changed and all of that stuff. However, you'll notice that down here in this window resized method that gets called from JavaScript, and we need this attribute JS invocable, and it needs to be public async task. When that gets called, we have to tell Blazor that the state has changed because it doesn't understand what's in JavaScript. JavaScript is a completely separate programming environment from the Blazor component model. And that's why they call it interop, JS interop, because you're interoperating, just like in the old days when we had to interop with COM, right? It's a completely different memory structure, it's reference counted, all that stuff. JavaScript is the same way. It exists separate from your application in C#. So, here's the thing. Anytime you have a JS invocable method and JavaScript calls it, and you're changing something on the screen, you have to let .NET Blazor, the Blazor component model, know by invoking state has changed. And so this on after render async happens when the state has changed and it re-renders. But the reason that we're doing this here, and we're calling register WPF app if it's the first render, and only if it's the first render, is because up until this point, the JavaScript system doesn't exist. So there are other lifetime virtual methods that you can, lifecycle methods that you can override on initialized, on parameter set, and all that stuff. You have to wait until after the first render to call JavaScript. So that's how that works. And this is the reference that we're passing, .NET object reference create from this. What's this? Index. So this is the index component. And that's how JavaScript knows when it calls, where am I? Let's get rid of this. Here it is. When it calls invoke method async on .NET helper, window resize, that's how it knows that it can do that. That's what makes it work. Okay, let's do it. So now every time the window resizes, because we're handling that resize event, our code will execute and we update the screen size. Well, we update message, which contains the width and height. Right? Let's look here again. The message is message updated. That's if we get width and height. But here, when window resized is called, message is screen size, width, height. Pretty cool, right? So call JavaScript from C#, call C# from JavaScript. All right, now we're going to clean up these using statements here. And I'm going to do that by adding global usings to app.xaml CS. This is a good place to do it. And again, it's telling us we don't even need these because we have this implicit usings feature of C# that we're leaning on. So going back to app.xaml here, we can get rid of this and then add these global using statements. Microsoft JS Interop and ASP.NET Core components, because those are the ones that we need. So let's go to index razor CS. That's our code behind file. We don't need that now. And child component razor CS. We don't need that. And just make sure it still works. And it does. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to add some Bootstrap. Bootstrap is not here. You don't see the Bootstrap CSS file. Bootstrap is Twitter's CSS library. It uses known names for classes, and Blazor takes advantage of it. So I could basically copy these files. I think I'll do that. I'll copy these files. But if you don't have access to the Bootstrap files locally, You can always just create a new Blazor WebAssembly application. Let's do that. We'll create a new Blazor WASM and just nick the files out of that. So let's do a Blazor WebAssembly app, not empty, because we want the Bootstrap stuff in there. Doesn't matter what we call it. So in here, if you look in Web, CSS, Bootstrap, you see this guy right there. I'm just going to copy it, boop, down to my web root. And now I can link it. This line right here. There it is. Don't need you. And now let's change the button on Index Razor to use one of those button classes. Class equals button, button primary. And now when I run this, it's going to look a lot more Blazor-y. See? When I did the zooming, it changes the width and height. Or at least it fires the resize. There you go. All right, so let's do a little interop here. We're going to access Razor component code from a WPF component. And the real challenge here is references, right? How does my WPF code know? Like, for example, if I put a button here and had a button click handler, how would that know where the Blazor stuff is? Well, to do that, I'm just going to create a static class that has those references, and I'll call it AppState. Here we go. We've got a public static index in a static class. An index is my index component, right? And so that's the name of it that I'm giving it. Static classes with static properties are essentially singletons that don't need to be instantiated. So there's only one instance, and you get what you get. And this is good because I only want one instance. Now we can access this, set it in index. We can set this index component in index Razor CS. So a few new things here. First of all, I exploded the message property. Now I have a backing field and just a regular getter, but my setter, I'm calling status change. Why? Because we're going to call this from WPF. And the Blazor component model will only call status changed automatically if you call into or access properties or call methods that modify the UI from a UI interaction on the Blazor side, right? So I need this. I need status changed here or else it won't work. It won't click. Now I'm overriding on initialized, which is another one of those lifecycle methods, virtual methods. And so this is sort of like your form load, right? This is the first thing that happens. So I'm basically saying appstate.index component is this, right? And the rest of this is still the same. So now we need to add a button, right? Go to our main window XAML, and I'm going to expand the grid to have 2 rows. So 2 row definitions. The first one is going to be 35 high, and then the second one will take up the rest of the space. That's what that asterisk is. So in the first row, I have a stack panel with a little bit of a margin, and I have a button, and then here's this button click method, WPF button. And the rest of this is exactly the same. I just exploded a little bit so that you can see I've added grid row equals 1, but these properties are the same. This is all the same. So now let's add that button click in the code behind. So here we go. We're saying appstate.indexComponent message, because remember we made that a public property on index, public string message. We made it a public property. So I'm saying message equals, and then shared string updated at current time. Here we go. All right, so notice when I do the scroll, I'm holding control and doing the scroll wheel. That's increasing the size inside the Blazor web view, not of the WPF app. Wouldn't it be cool if we could do that for WPF? All right, so if I click WPF button, there we go. Now we've updated the message property of the index page or component. Works the same way for non-page components. In fact, if you notice, there isn't any page. There's no page directive in index because that's for the router. That page directive in a Blazor application at the top of a page like counter or fetch data or index, that's so that you can route. But we don't have a router, right? So we don't need that. This is just a component. It happens to be my top level component, but this is no different than child component. Okay, let's consume a third-party Blazor component. And I chose this guy, Blazor Extensions Canvas. So this gives you access in C# through Blazor to an HTML canvas. It's pretty cool. And if you want to just use it in a Blazor app, there's some demo code here. And we're going to use this same demo code, but we're going to do it in our WPF app. So let me update the CS proj file rather than waiting for NuGet and all that to just include this Blazor Extensions Canvas. That's all I need to do. Now I need to add a script tag to index. Let's go in between these two script tags. Just put that in there. So this loads up the JavaScript that's required for Blazor Extensions Canvas. We'll add an @using statement to imports Razor. And we'll add a few global usings, because why not? Whether we use them or not. Right now, you can save everything, go to index Razor, and just instantiate a BE canvas, Blazor Extensions Canvas, with the width and height. And we have an @ref here. If you're not familiar with that in Blazor, this points to an object of BE canvas type, and that would be the name of the variable. So we obviously need to make that work. So let's go to code behind and add those right here. So it's a BE canvas component. We also need this 2D context. You'll see why in just a second. Because what we're going to do is change on initialized. We'll still keep this. It looks like I blew that away, didn't I? Now, make sure that still works. Right. So everything's. Ooh. Oh, I did it in the wrong place. I'm sorry. got confused. That happens to me sometimes. We want to override this guy on initialized, on after render, not uninitialized. So if it's the first render, we're registering just like we did before. And now I'm creating the context from canvas reference, create canvas 2D async. And then this is all stuff that you would normally do in JavaScript, right? Set the fill style to green, fill a rectangle, set a font, display some text. Like that's pretty simple. Now I'm not an expert on the canvas, and that's why I just chose to use their demo code. But the fact is that it works. And if you know somebody on your team that knows how to program the canvas, why, more power to you. That's going to work. So one of the greatest features of Blazor is cascading values and cascading components, cascading parameters. And basically, in app.razor, you have a router which handles all of the page routes and displays a page, a routable component, based on the name, right? Based on where it comes from. And you can wrap the whole router in, yeah, let's look. I have a Blazor app right here. So in app.razor, you can take an object, from a reference and cascade it. You have a cascading instance essentially that follows the router. And what that means is that in any of the pages or any of the other components, you can use as a cascading parameter with that attribute. It basically grabbed that reference, and it's one reference per user, right? So it's not a shared reference. I just pointed that out because there isn't any router in here. So how do you use a third-party tool that was meant to be a cascading object in a WPF app? Well, it's not as difficult as it seems. I'm going to add a reference to Blazor modal. Blazor modal is a great open source modal dialogue library for Blazor, written by Chris Sainty, who's freaking brilliant. I learned so much from him. If you haven't subscribed to his stuff and looked at all the things that he offers for free, you're definitely missing out. So this is if you're a Blazor programmer. But hey, if you're a WPF programmer, you want to use this, that's what we're here to do. So once we've got the the package loaded, we can add our imports Razor using statements. And we can add a couple of global using statements for C# code. Global using statements have to come first before any local using statements. And now check this out. Let's go to main window XAML CS. And remember I told you could just add to the service, like this is what you would do in ASP.NET, services.add whatever. But service collection, add Blazor modal right there. And that adds it to the app, basically. So now let's go to the components folder and add a Razor component. And it's going to be called display message. This is going to be our modal. So we've got a message parameter that we pass in. We have a couple of methods for handling the submit and cancel. So it's going to need a code behind file. So let me do that now. So look at this. Here's our cascading parameter. Well, where did that come from? Well, we'll get to that. but it's basically counting on there being a cascading parameter out there in the ether for Blazor modal instance. And that's what it's going to use. So Blazor modal close async, cancel async, we get that from this Blazor modal instance. This parameter attribute means that message is a parameter when you create this display message as an instance, and we can pass that message in. So now let's update our index razor. All right, we just added this show modal, but did you notice this? Cascading Blazor modal. You just put it around. I mean, that's how cascading works. It goes around whatever markup you want to be able to access that in. So that's how you can put it around the entire wrapper in a Blazor application, and it's accessible everywhere. It cascades down the tree. So we need this show modal method in the code behind. So we're creating some parameters, modal parameters, and we're adding for this display message message property, hey WPF, and then we're going to show that modal dialog display message, and this is the message itself, and this can be anything, you know. Woohoo! So let's run it. All right, so now I've got a show modal button. Click that. Look at that. Modal dialog box. But more importantly, it's a third-party tool that requires a cascading value. All right. Now we're going to call, and I think this is the last demo here. Yes. We're going to call WPF code from Blazor. We did it the other way around, right? We have this button that we can call from Blazor code from WPF. Right here, we can change the message. But going back the other way, guess what? It's kind of the same thing in reverse. We're going to go to our app state and add a static property main window. So main window is this guy, right? Yes, that's fine. So main window, I'm going to grab a reference to that, and we're going to do that in the code here. So in main window, I have all of my stuff, and I'm initializing component, and then I say appstate.mainWindow is this. Now I've also added show message box, which is a public method on our main window. Pass in the message, and it's going to do some C# code that works in WPF. Message box. We're just going to show that. So now we're going to go back to index razor, and we'll add this right here, button, and now you can see we've got the bootstrap stuff going on here. And on click, we're going to call a method called talk to WPF, so we'll add that method. So app state main window, if it's not null, show message box, hey, this is Blazor calling. Talk to WPF, Blazor calling. All right, so let me just summarize what we've done. It's kind of a mind blower, isn't it? This is a WPF app. Here's a WPF button in a WPF grid. Then when we click that, updates code in our Blazor page or component. And then we can call into JavaScript from C#. We can call C# from JavaScript. We can use third-party components like this one. We can use third-party components that require cascading parameters. And we can call WPF code from Blazor. Oh yeah, don't forget, you can make child components and deal with those as well. That is my talk. And so I'll happily unshare my screen and take any questions that anyone has.
Carl, I have a couple questions actually.
Sure.
So how, and it's not, I mean, what you showed is really cool. It's not so much about what you showed, but maybe how you would take that to the next step. You know, maybe I want to use this as kind of a replacement for a desktop app. So initially, what's the use case for this? What would be the best place for this kind of operation to fit in a developer, the kind of things a developer might be asked to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why are we doing this? What's the point?
I think I said it nicer than that, but
no, but it's absolutely a great question. There's a few reasons. So one is, you know, you're working for a company and you've got a web team and you have a customer and they want a WPF application, right? Now what do? Do you say, no, we don't do that. We're a web company. We know Blazor. We know all the web stuff, the JavaScript. You can say no. You can learn XAML. And if you have Blazor developers, you're going to watch them bang their head against their desks and scream in pain and howl when they have to learn XAML and all of its intricacies and bindings and converters and everything that goes along with it. Or you might have existing WPF app that the customer says, we want to be able to access our web content from that. And so now you make another page and you have the web content right there in your app. You know, it could be, it doesn't have to be a grid, right? It could be a slider or something like that. Or, you know, when you select something, a pane on the right or the left opens up and you're browsing the web, right? So that is just the case for the web view. But on top of that, you can implement your own code in Blazor. I love WPF for what it does. And if I was going to build a Windows app today, I would use WPF. If I had to use XAML controls, I will use XAML controls, but my go-to is Blazor just because the UI is so much better, in my opinion. I love Billy Hollis. I respect him. He spent a lot of time learning XAML and disseminating it for us and teaching us how to use it. He's not the only one, but even Billy admits that the Blazor binding model is so much cleaner than XAML.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And I've met Billy. He is great. I do enjoy him.
He's awesome.
Yeah. So I'm trying to understand how I would add other features that I would have in a typical app. And so things like authentication, database, menus, and I'm assuming that we would just do those in potentially, especially the database interaction, maybe that would be done through the WPF side, and then we just communicate and wrap over to the Blazor. But you tell me if I'm not right or if there's other better ways.
I think, yeah, so think of it this way. You have a WPF app, right? So XAML is on the outside of the onion. It's the outer layer. So you could have your your slide out bars, XAML. You could have a toolbar that's XAML, and that could call into different pages or components that get shown inside that web view, right? So, but the outer layer has to be XAML. It doesn't work the other way around. You can't embed XAML in a Blazor view. That just doesn't work.
Okay.
Right. So you can mix and match so long as that outer layer is XAML.
Okay. And so if you want to, let's say, for example, you want to interact with a local SQL Server database, you still would be able to use Dapper, correct?
Yeah, you can use whatever you want because the UI is the UI. It's not the platform. So the web view doesn't have the restrictions that the browser has when you're building a Blazor application, right? It's not a sandboxed app. So in your code behind, in your Blazor components, you have full access to the machine. You can load a file from documents, you can save, you can write, you can do whatever you want. You can access databases, you can build API layers, right? You can do anything at all. And you can even kick off and do authentication with C#, from your Blazor stuff. Like you don't have the restrictions. So I think that's a really good question, because so many people, they think Blazor web, and web is a sandbox, and I want to be able to reach outside it. Well, you absolutely can. You have the UI power of Blazor, and then the platform power of Windows combined.
And I think it's that combination that makes it powerful, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was my questions. I think, just trying to picture in my own mind how I might use this, and there's a lot of advantages to a desktop app still. I'm a fan
Sure.
of desktop apps. I get frustrated with the restrictions of a pure web app sometimes.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, but it really just comes down to, if you're doing a desktop app, do you want to do it in XAML, or if you have Blazor chops, would you like to use that? And the answer for me is a resounding yes. I will use Blazor everywhere I possibly can.
And because we're desktop based, we're not suffering any of the performance issues that sometimes are
Correct.
mentioned about Blazor on the web.
Yeah, that's right. You're not running in a browser. You're running a browser window you're not running in a browser that's sharing space and all of that with the rest of the tabs in the browser, right? You're running a separate instance inside of the WPF app. Yeah,
Okay.
but remember, most of the performance issues that people talk about with Blazor are load time. It takes a long time to load, because it has to load up all the DLLs and stuff, and those have to come over the wire from the server. Well, that's not so with WPF. They're built in. All of the DLLs that run in Blazor in the browser view, in the web view, are already right there.
Okay. And when I do all of these things, when I build a WPF deployment, I'm deploying my WPF application the way I normally would.
Mm-hmm.
All of this stuff gets sucked in. There's nothing different I have to do for a deployment.
No, that's right. The WebView WPF control that we added, right at the beginning, contains everything and brings everything along with it to the party.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. I'm out of questions finally.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question, Carl. Hopefully I'm audible now.
Yeah.
So where do you see WPF fitting in to the .NET development landscape? Now we have things like Blazor and Maui.
Sure. WPF is still the pinnacle of Windows desktop development. It still is the big, I don't know what you call it. Insert your favorite noun here, or not pejor, but you know what I'm saying? It's the big platform for Windows, right? Windows Forms has limitations in that it's pixel based. WPF is raster based, so it is the best of Windows development. WinUI is new, but you can think of that as sort of coming from Windows 8, Windows Universal Apps. It's still limited, and in fact, building a Maui app, if you're just going to build for Windows, isn't smart. Because WinUI, first of all, has limitations. Second of all, what am I trying to say? Did you ever have one of those moments? No? Never?
Always.
Yeah, so it has limitations, right? And why would you build for all these other platforms and not use the state of the art? So if I was going to build a Windows app, right, and that's it. My customers want just a Windows app that's performant, and I have Blazor chops, I would definitely choose this. If it had to also go everywhere else, right, web, mobile, then I would choose Maui. Or I might do both. I might do Maui for the mobile devices and maybe even the Mac desktop, and then use WPF for Windows. If I had limitations with WinUI, if it's going to work on WinUI, then and you want to do a Maui app, then great.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you.
How hard is it to share Blazor components between those different application types?
You build a DLL. Essentially, you build a Razor class library project and compile it, and you can even publish it to NuGet. I have code on Blazor Train that shows you how to do that, videos. But yeah, it's very simple. It's just you just share it as a DLL, add a reference.
So other than probably the difference between running in a sandbox and not running in a sandbox, there's not many other gotchas? Because obviously you could run stuff in WPF without being in a sandbox that you wouldn't be able to necessarily. You may run into
You're not in a sandbox with WPF Blazor.
No, but if you're going to a browser-based, if you're trying to share components between WPF and the browser,
Okay.
You'd have to worry about the sandboxing and non-sandboxing differences.
Yeah, sure.
Are there any other gotchas that you'd have to watch out for?
If you're running on the web,
Yep.
or
if you were trying to share components between the two.
No, I mean you just have to program them as if they were completely standalone. Blazor server is a different animal altogether, where all of the resources can live on the server. But Blazor WebAssembly requires that if it's going to go get data, it needs to be, needs to go through an API layer, and you have to have authorization and all of that stuff. So you still have those issues. But other than that, other than just basic architecture of being a standalone component, no. Load time, load time is faster in a WPF app. Whereas if you're running it in a Blazor application, a Blazor WebAssembly application, you have that load time issue I was talking about.
Okay.
Yeah. Other than that, it's the same code.
So, Carl, one more question. A little bit further out, you obviously jumped on the Blazor train with Blazor, and you're all the way behind it.
Yeah.
But what excites you now? What's the next best cool thing that you'd be excited about?
Definitely Blazor United. So if you don't know the difference between a Blazor server and a Blazor WebAssembly application today, the WebAssembly application runs completely in the browser, whereas the server, all the UI interactions go back. It's more like Ajax, but it's all done for you. It goes back round trip to the server. The server is where the code is, and for every user in a Blazor server application, kind of like ASP.NET Web Forms did, except that it keeps a graph in memory of the user's DOM, document object model, and runs the code against it on the server. And then anything that changes, it takes the diff and then sends these typed binary messages over SignalR back to the browser through JavaScript saying, set the inner text of this div to that and these things. And that all happens behind the scenes in a Blazor server app. So the benefit is it's faster because it doesn't have to load and download all of the DLLs for Blazor. And also another benefit of Blazor server is that all the code, all the resources, like your databases and all of that stuff, you can just call directly from the code because you're already on the server. You don't need to have layer, an API layer. So the downside is that you have to have a beefy server to handle that, and it doesn't have to be that beefy. It's not that bad. Like a standard one CPU of 3.5 gigs of RAM can handle 5,000 concurrent users easily. And so when people say to me, what should I use, Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly? The first thing I say is, well, how many users do you have, right? And if they're looking to do the next Facebook, WebAssembly. All right, so Blazor United essentially allows you to combine components that run in the browser and components that run on the server in the same project. Not only that, but you can start on the server with Blazor Server, and then as the users are, it's fast, and then as people are using it in the download, in the background, the WebAssembly DLLs for the CLR and all that are being downloaded, and as soon as they're up and running, it switches. So you get the great startup time of Blazor Server, and then you get the performance, I guess you would call it that. It doesn't. You'd have to be doing some real tight loop stuff in order to see a performance difference, but you get essentially running in the browser for free. So Blazor United is coming in .NET 8, and I think it's absolutely brilliant.
So you mentioned Steve Sanderson was responsible for what we were seeing. Steve is still behind this effort as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if the WPF, I'm sorry, the WebView control was based on stuff that he wrote. I think it was called Web Window or something like that, but another team took it over. But he's the mad genius behind Blazor and all the innovations that happen with it, including Blazor United.
I guess I'm a little confused. You said that if in Blazor United, it would download the WASM tools it needs, and then so that it could take over, but then it's running in the sandbox at that point, right?
Well, it's running in a sandbox no matter what.
No matter what. Okay.
Yeah, the code that runs on the server has access to server resources. Code that runs on the client does not. So if you're going to build a component or a page, let's say, that is using this new auto mode, which is what they call it, that starts out on the server and ends up on the client, you need to program that as if those resources aren't local. In other words, you need to build an API layer, and you need to have all of the, right.
Okay, so you don't have that direct database access necessarily.
You won't. I mean, if you're running on the client and you go to, load up a EF context or whatever, it's just not going to happen because it's not there. But that was one of the first questions I had too. And you can look at a recent episode of Blazor Train where I interviewed Steve about this, and you can see that was a confusing point for me as well. But he also said that it's in real early stages and they haven't really worked out details, like that, but they will.
Okay.
Anybody else?
No.
Okay then.
No, I don't think so. Thank you so much, Carl. That was excellent.
I'm glad you liked it. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so I pasted the link into the chat window for the survey. I will also send that out via email in case you didn't happen to see it. If you could please fill out that survey to leave Carl feedback on his presentation. I will leave that open for about 24 hours, at which point I'll combine the feedback and I'll get you a summary of those results, Carl.
Okay. Thank you.
No, I think it's really great. wouldn't have thought you could do all those things. And
Yeah.
I think that's my main takeaway. Is like, oh my God, you can actually do that.
Yeah, that was my first reaction as well.
All right, well, awesome. Thank you very much, Carl, and for helping kick off our 20th year. We appreciate that immensely. It's an honor, a privilege, and I'm just, Steve will know, how excited I was when you said you'd do it. Steve does know how excited I was.
Good. Great. Happy to do it, and congratulations on 20 years.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations to .NET Rocks on 20 years. 21
Yeah, that's
years.
right. We're on 21 years now. Yeah. All right, guys. I'm out.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.
Excellent.